Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today I want to talk about sequences and specifically how to arrange them. So here I have an almost finished production. I've shown this track many times on my channel already. But what is interesting about this project is that it's one of the first projects in which I started writing the project where I have my sequences and one shot separated in different groups. If you remember before this, I used to just have a leads group and I would throw both my sequences as well as my one shot leads into the same group. Now, to be honest, I can just kind of show you the concept of what I'm going to talk about today by just looking at this part here. You can see we start with no sequences, then we have very little sequences in, for example, the second section, and then it just becomes more and more and more. But what is interesting, in my opinion, is a little bit more of a deep dive into that concept. I guess that we all know that like a Psytrance track, it builds up gradually. Even if it's not like progressive Psytrance, you still tend to have fewer sequences at the beginning of your drops, and then you build up the energy over time. This is usually also reflected in something like the drums, where you have very little in terms of drums at the beginning. And then as you can see, when the energy rises of your track, you also increase the amount of different drums that you have. So as I said before, we start out with no sequences in the first segment of the drop. But for the second segment, we have this one here. As you can hear, some very nice grid synths. I believe I've already made a video, either a video or a short on this particular sound here. So I'm not going to go into depth on how I create these sequences. I just want to focus on the arrangement for now. If there is a particular sequence that you like and that you want me to explain, then I can make a separate video on that. So let me know with a comment in the comment section. But back into the arrangement, as you can see, we have our grid synths here. And then, as you can also see, there's a lot more one-shots in here than there is in the first part or even in the part after that. So this is really kind of your transition period between a very sequence heavy section of the track and a very one-shot heavy section of the track. I would say that even though there's fewer one-shots in here, this is heavier on the one-shots because it usually tends to be the case that the delays are longer and just overall the one-shots grab your attention much more than they do in this part. You can hear that in this first segment, the one-shots are a lot more attention-grabbing. They tend also to be longer in terms of their length, right? Just the length of the clip and the length of the element that plays. But overall here, the one-shots are kind of overpowering each other. But then as we go into a part where the sequences get very heavy, where you're going to go into a part where there's a lot of different sequences, what tends to happen is that you just leave a lot more room in your one-shots for your sequences to exist. Now, before we continue, I do quickly want to say that if you want to support the channel, you can do so by liking and subscribing. Also, if you want to support me financially, check out my products on Gumroad or support me on Patreon. For Patreon supporters, there's a bunch of different benefits, including discount codes for my products. So if you intend on buying some of my products, you can save some money by first supporting me on Patreon. I'll leave links for both my products as well as my Patreon in the description. But with that being said, let's get back into the video. So here we get two new sounds in here. You can hear that we get these bandpass sequences as well as the offbeat sound, and together they are grouped together so that I can apply some effects to them combined. But I would personally say that with all of these sequences, we haven't really heard anything kind of special in terms of, I don't know, the kind of texture or really being an element that is memorable and gives you really a unique feeling to the track. In my opinion, the first sequence that really does this is the one that comes in here, and this one sounds like this. So what we can say is that there's basically two types of sequences. You have the ones that are your main elements that should grab the attention and should make the track memorable. And then you have the supporting elements, for example, like this, and in this case also these kind of grid synths here. If we listen to all of the sequences together, these are less overpowering and they give enough space for this sound to actually become memorable and stand out and be unique and do everything that it needs to do. And really the same is true for the next section, in which we have this kind of melodic sequence here. This was kind of inspired by more like a Goa kind of feeling. So you get a nice melodic element out of that. And again, what you'll see is that there's some supporting sequences. In this case, I opted to leave a little bit more space by removing this sequence here. Also, this sequence has been playing for such a long time that at this point, having it just play over and over and over again becomes boring. What you'll see that for my main sequences, I'll tend to keep them to one section. And then when it comes to supporting sequences, I like to play with them maybe 2, maybe 3 sections long. And even then, for the supporting elements, they become boring at some point. You don't always want to have the same supporting sequences. Now right here, this is the portion where we really switch the whole identity of the track. I'm going to play this in context so that you can hear. So again, we have our main sequence, which is just these kind of squelches. And then we have a supporting element to that, which is this kind of glitchy sound here. Again, in the track, you cannot really hear this element standing out, and that is because it is supporting this other element here. So we can say that this is the supporting element and this is our main sequence that is grabbing the attention and making the track memorable. Now, something that I often hear for like newer producers, and what they tend to do is that they tend to build up the energy of their track with some sequences and then they keep those same sequences, right? They will create a lead like that lead and then they try to make the whole track revolve around that one lead. That doesn't really work. As I said before, it gets boring very, very quickly. So in this case, I would say that this is actually a very cool example of how you can make your track less boring by just having this complete switch up and changing out not only like your main elements, but also all of your supporting elements. So you're just really going into a new section where nothing is the same as it was before. And in this case, that's even reflected in the one-shots, as I designed own one-shots that really sit in here apart from this one. This particular one shot right here is also present in other parts of the track, but all of this stuff down here is basically unique to this section of the track. Then we go into the progressive drop. I'm going to skip that for now and we'll look into this part instead. Here, part of the sequences, I would say, is actually this vocal, this one here. I left it in the vocal group because I like to just separate things that are vocals in an actual vocal group, but you can basically hear that this is also a sequence. This is where it plays in the break, so we are preparing the listener for it when it comes back into the drop. And then it's going into this build-up part. Part of this build-up is also, I believe this one, the same kind of vocal. I'm just looping a very small segment of that sequence and then drowning it in reverb so that you get a nice texture out of it. And then it's just like rising in pitch and rising in frequency content, maybe with some filtering, stuff like that. And this is what takes over in the build-up. And then we go back into it actually being a sequence again, and it actually just playing the different like sequence elements. So just so you hear what that sounds like, I'm going to play it in context.
Because when you lose, you win too. Because if you paid attention, you learn stuff. So what that means, if we look at an arrangement point of view, is that
Here in this first drop, we don't really start with a sequence, but because there's this build-up here and we're already kind of in the middle of the track and energy is already high coming out of this break with the sequence already being in the break, this is actually a much better place to just dive into a sequence immediately and just, continue the energy and have it high energy right from the get-go. Now, there's another interesting thing that I'm doing here in the sense that this sequence is coming in kind of like early. If you want to just have the kind of arrangement idea that I said before, where each sequence has its own section, then what you would see is that you would have something like this, where this sequence is responsible for this section, and then the vocal sequence is responsible for this section right here. So this is the vocal sequence. It's responsible for this part of the track, right up until about here. And then right from about here, we switch to the other sequence. The point of not doing that, the point of kind of breaking the rule is again to spice things up a little bit. We kind of use the rules to establish our kind of main idea, right, of how the arrangement should work. And then we do these little things where we just, in this case, break the rule by having the sequence come in early. And that way it just becomes a little bit more interesting. One of the things that is crucial to note though is that you need to announce it. The way that we're doing it is technically the sequence kind of starts here in the sense that the idea starts here, but we have this little part here where it just kind of announces it. It's coming in a little bit early. This is combined with a lack of baseline here so that you have a little bit more like space to focus on the actual new thing coming in. We have this one shot that kind of covers it up and helps with the transition, but really it's like giving a lot of space for this element to just kind of grab your attention and say, okay, now I'm here, now you have to pay attention to me as well, as it's layered on top of this other vocal sequence. Next up, we're using another trick to make the track a little bit more interesting, and that is this like elongated fill here almost. It's not even elongated because technically this section is kind of offset. I talked about this in the video Learning from the Masters, which actually uploaded today as I'm filming this. So I'll leave a link into the description if you want a little bit more detail on kind of the arrangement of where you have these sections and fills and why the grid is kind of offset here, as in the drop starts not on the actual like start of the 16 bar section, but 1 bar later. But what this essentially gives us in terms of arrangement specifically for sequences is that it gives us a free pass of not having to introduce it before, in that this is just empty and it allows us to really introduce a very like attention grabbing sequence without having it clash with other elements. For example, going back here to this melodic element here, when it comes to introducing this element, what happens is that it's already playing on top of this other element here. And what I talked about before is that you really want to have things separated, but there is the consideration of having to prepare the listener for the things that are about to come. So here you can hear this initial sequence that I talked about before already playing, and then we come in here and this is just kind of coming in. You can hear it sits in there ever so slightly. It just makes its presence known. And then in the fill, it's really where it's just like opening up and then it takes over as the main element. That's kind of what you want. But that does mean that there's not a lot of space prior for this element starting. Like it's basically the fill is the space that you have to work with where you can really make the element come in. And before that, it just needs to basically act like a supporting element, even though it's technically like your main sequence for the next section. Doing this allows us to really just have the space necessary for this section to come in. And technically what I would be able to do is even have this part still play over here if I wanted to.
Whatever you want to do, believe it, believe it, believe it. Even if you don't believe, play the game, believe it.
So you can hear this is really a section where the sequence just kind of has its own space. In this case, it is hindered a little bit, not hindered, but it is taking up a little bit of the space of the vocal. So the vocal is the main element that should be there. but you can hear that it has a lot more space still to make its presence known before it actually like starts being the main sequence. The final main sequence that sits in this track is again using this kind of switch up idea, in the sense that we are building up here to a high point and then it just drops out the original sequence, and we have this sequence coming in early, it's coming in the fill, and then it just announces like, okay, I'm going to take over, and then you immediately go into the drop. So you can hear this is much more of an abrupt transition here. And what is interesting about all of these transitions and how they are working is how you combine them together. What you'll see is that it's never the same thing like back to back, right? We don't have a fast takeover here followed by another fast takeover followed by another fast takeover in every section. That gets, again, very, very boring very quickly. So for example, in this drop, we start off with a sequence coming in 8 bars early and just making its presence known very, very early, kind of layering on top of this other main sequence. Then the next one, we just finish the section without even a fill. And we have this little 4-bar part here where the sequence really takes over and comes in the sense that there's not even a kick and bass where it's competing with it. You just have the full attention with the sequence. And then on the next one, we have this quick takeover in the fill. And then, for example, for the next one, the sequence just stops. There is the fill. And then we go into the final outro sequence here. Now, this part of the production, as I said, the production isn't completely finished. So you can see that there's a few things missing still. I might change this here, but this is still a good example of how I'm using different ways of transitioning to make each section and make each sequence within that section interesting and unique. Because to be honest, in Psytrance, when it comes to like synth sounds, we have basically like discovered all of the synth sounds, I would say. Not so much every exact sound and every exact combination of modulations and stuff like that. But if you look at like sound categories, which we tend to use, you can probably name a few different like ideas or categories of sounds that are used. For example, FM synths. You have your kind of standards like particles, what people would say, bandpass plugs. You have your grid synths, where you just have a couple of synths playing together and repeating in this pattern throughout the sequence. You have your acid leads, you have your melodic elements. All of those kind of categories are already known, and there's not a lot of things that you can do in terms to play with just like the sound design itself. What's easier to play with is how you introduce elements and how you play with how elements kind of come in and overtake each other and become part of different sections and stuff like that. So that was the objective of the video, to show you how you can play with different sequences and actually introduce them into the track, as in have the listener, know what is going to play. And as I said, the objective of this video was to show you that part of kind of sequence making, which is equally important as the sound design itself. So hopefully you learned something from this one. Let me know if you did by leaving a like. And if you're new here, make sure that you're subscribed. But that's going to be it. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.